welcome to Mr. Otter Studio. Today we're going to learn how to make a bronze sculpture using the lost wax method. I'm going to show you the process with two different sculptures that I made. So the first one is this oil-based otter on the left, and then also a 3D printed temple that I altered. This video goes into depth, but if you just want a really quick overview, here it is. First, you make a mold of the model. Then you pour wax into that mold. After you take the wax out, you're going to attach it to a cup using wax sprues. The next step is to dip it into a slurry mix, let it dry. Then you're going to burn out the wax. So you're going to harden the shell and melt the wax out. So now you have an empty space where that sculpture was. Then you're going to pour liquid bronze into your mold. Then you need to get the shell off of your bronze. Then metal chasing just to attach pieces and to remove any imperfections during the casting process. The last step is the patina, or the painting of the bronze. Step number one is to make your model. A lot of artists make their model out of oil-based clay. You can use wax and many other materials. Step number two is mold making. The mold is one of the most important parts because if they miss a piece or it's not made well, then it's going to interfere with the process later on. So each one of these steps is critical, and since mold making is first, it's probably one of the most important parts. So the mold is made out of the original model. If there's a long, thin piece of a sculpture, it might be molded separately. Some models actually have to be kind of cut apart in this process. And there's going to be two layers. There's going to be this soft layer, and that's what you're going to see first. This silicone or rubber layer. And that's the soft layer that captures all of the details, and it's really important that there aren't air bubbles and that it covers the whole thing. There can be a layer of mesh added to strengthen it. And then you also need to add these little buttons that are going to hold the outer hard shell onto the softer inner shell. You can add shims to separate parts of the mold. Most molds have at least two pieces. After the inner softer layer is dry, you need to make your plaster and harder outer shell. You carefully mix the plaster material. You can add some fiber to it to support the larger pieces. Carefully cover one side of the mold first. Smoothing it out, adding layers until it's thick enough, and you can add shims to separate the two sides. Then you're going to cover the second side of the model with plaster. And you need to make sure it covers that softer inner layer completely. After it's dry, you're going to drill holes through it. Holes are usually drilled through it so that you can use screws later on to attach the pieces of the mold back together. First, the outer harder shell is carefully removed. Then the softer inner mold is removed very carefully. The plaster mold is cleaned up, and then the rubber mold is also washed and cleaned. The molds are put together to make sure that they fit well. And screws are added to keep the molds together later on in the process. Step number three is the wax pour. Once the mold is finished, hot wax is poured in and swished around until it coats the mold evenly. So the key is coating it evenly and also capturing all of the details. And this, as you can see in my small otter mold, there's just a little hole to pour the wax in, making sure the wax covers the entire inner surface of the mold. And this process is repeated until it is thick enough, usually about 1/8 of an inch thick. Let them cool off and then carefully remove the model from the molds. So now you have a hollow wax copy of your model. Step number 5 is wax chasing. So this is actually where I used to work. So I love this step. And you're going to use hot metal tools, sometimes dental tools, to rub out the marks that show the parting lines of the molds, or you're also going to fill in air bubbles with wax and make that model look like the original. You're basically trying to hide any imperfections in the molding process and in the wax process. It should look like the finished piece at this point, even if it is kind of in pieces. You can also remove small vents for small pieces just so the bronze cools evenly. After the sculpture is chased, then you need to sprue the sculpture. And the wax cylinders that you attach from the cup out to the sculpture, it's called spruing. And these are basically the channels that the bronze is going to go through into the sculpture. And the reason this is really important is because this is how the bronze will flow from that cup into the sculpture. So if you attach the sprues wrong, it's not going to pour out in bronze well. So you have to really be thinking about gravity and think about the sculpture upside down when you're doing this process, because you want everything to flow evenly into the sculpture. Step number 7 is slurry. After you've attached your sculpture to the cup in wax and you fix it up, then you take it to the slurry room. A sprued wax copy is dipped into a slurry mixture. Then it's covered in a sand-like stucco or dry crystalline silica. That's a really small grain size. And this combination basically creates like a ceramic shell, even though it's not really ceramic. It's kind of the idea of like a ceramic shell. And repeat it until it's about 1/2 inch thick all over the wax sprued piece. After you get it thick enough, you allow that shell to dry, and the cup usually ends up being kind of like the stand for the sculpture during this process. Step number 8 is burnout. So this is where we're going to get rid of the wax and harden up that outer shell. So the ceramic shell coated piece is placed in a kiln, heated up so that the coatings harden up into a shell and the wax melts out. So all that remains of the original artwork is the negative space inside of this shell. Now all of those feeder tubes and those wax cylinders are hollow so the bronze can flow through those channels into the sculpture. Step number 9 is pouring, and this is where we're going to put the bronze into the sculpture. It's really important that the ceramic shells have been heated up, because if the hot bronze hits them and they're not heated up, they'll just crack. So the shells are heated up in a kiln. Once the bronze is up to temperature, they will bring the pieces out into like a sand-filled tub. So the cup is up, ready for the bronze to be poured inside. The bronze will be brought over and poured into each of the cups of the different models. The cooling of the bronze is important. It shouldn't cool faster at the bottom than at the top. So oftentimes a piece of insulation will be added to the top of the cup to prevent uneven cooling. So the filled shells are then allowed to dry evenly. Step number 10 is releasing the shell. So the shell is hammered off or sandblasted away. So the shell is hammered off. They usually just hammer the cup and that will break the shell off of the model. And then the sprues that were used to hold it to the cup are now cut off. Step number 11 is metal chasing. And honestly, when I was working at Adonis Bronze, this was the hardest step, I thought. You're working with these giant pieces of bronze in most cases and trying to recreate the texture of oil-based clay with metal chasing materials, like with a welder and with Dremels. And so just like the wax copies were chased, now the casting is also chased and put back together. So the seams are removed to make it look like it was never apart, and any air bubbles can be filled back in. Any of the vents that we had to cut off are put back on. Oftentimes some sculptures need to be ground down just to even it up, make sure it can stand. And step number 12 is the patina. There's so many different ways for you to finish a bronze sculpture. You can paint onto it. You can add a patina. A patina will react to the different metals that are in the bronze and kind of change the color of them. And I love just the classic green that you get because of the copper. So that's what I chose to go with. So you heat it up first if you're using this method, and then you're going to use heat and, in this case, potash to create this green looking patina. You can kind of adjust the patina after you've put it on by keeping it more saturated in some areas or rubbing it off in some areas. With this technique, you're going to finish it by adding wax. And when I worked there, the next step actually would be putting it on a base. Typically, there's like a soft kind of velvety material that's glued to the bottom of a bronze sculpture to keep it from scratching the surface that it's on, or it's attached to a base. And that base could be wood, it could be marble, it could be so many different things. One thing I love about bronze is I love the history of it. I love how it's been used for thousands of years. Maybe I'll make a whole video about the history of bronze and how someone just decided randomly to put together tin and copper, and that created something harder than both of those metals. and how the creation of bronze had endless possibilities because of its strength, and it revolutionized warfare, agriculture. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you now understand how to make a bronze sculpture using the lost wax process. I think it's absolutely fascinating and seriously one of my favorite jobs I've ever had. I also need to thank all of the people at Adonis Bronze for being so accommodating, letting me film this process, asking tons of questions, and just making me feel right at home.